The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, and it smelled like lavender water and polished mahogany, two things that had no business existing in the dusty town of Caldwell, Kansas. Letitia Conley sat on the front step of her father's dry goods store, the envelope balanced on her knees, the wax seal of her mother's family crest pressed into deep burgundy against the cream paper. She already knew what was inside before she broke it open. She had been expecting it for 3 years, ever since her father had packed up their modest life in Philadelphia and dragged her and her younger sister west on a promise of open land and honest work. Her mother's family back in Boston had watched from a polite and well-mannered distance, and now, apparently, they had decided they had waited long enough. The letter was from her uncle, Edmund Hartwell, a man of considerable means who owned a textile company and a brownstone on Beacon Hill, and who had never once soiled his hands with anything more demanding than the turning of a newspaper page. His handwriting was precise and small, each letter formed with the careful pressure of a man who believed penmanship reflected moral character. Letitia read the letter twice, slowly, and then she folded it along its original creases and placed it back in the envelope. Her uncle was offering her a position as the head of his household. His wife had passed the previous autumn, leaving him with 3 young children and a large staff that apparently required a steady feminine hand to manage. He would pay her generously. She would have her own rooms, access to the finest social circles in Boston, and in his words, a life befitting a woman of her education and refinement. He reminded her, gently but with unmistakable intention, that Caldwell, Kansas was no place for a young woman of 22 years, that the frontier was rough and unforgiving, and that she was wasting the best years of her life breathing trail dust and minding a store counter. He was not entirely wrong, and that was the part that made her stomach turn. She set the envelope on the step beside her and looked out at the main street of Caldwell. The town was awake and loud in the particular way that frontier towns were loud, which was to say it was all commerce and urgency and the bellowing of men who had somewhere important to be. Cattle drives came through Caldwell regularly, and the town had grown fast because of it, sprouting saloons and hotels and supply shops at a pace that barely kept up with the demand. The air smelled of horse, sawdust, and the iron-tinged wind that came off the open plains in the morning. A wagon rolled past trailing a cloud of chalky dust. 2 cowboys on horseback followed it at a loose, easy pace, their hats tipped low against the brightening sun. One of them she recognized. George Hunter sat his horse the way men who had grown up on horseback sat their horses, which was to say he looked entirely at home, as though the animal and the man were one continuous thing. He was 26 years old and had been working the cattle trail out of Texas for the better part of 4 years, driving longhorns north to the railheads. He was tall in the saddle, lean and weathered, with sun-darkened skin and the kind of quiet in his eyes that came from spending months at a stretch under an open sky with no one to talk to but the other drovers and the wind. Letitia had spoken to him exactly 4 times. The first time had been in February, when he had come into her father's store to purchase rope and a tin of coffee, and had accidentally knocked a bolt of calico fabric off the counter reaching across for change. He had apologized with such genuine, flustered sincerity that she had laughed before she could stop herself, and he had gone red beneath his tan. The second time had been a week later, when he had returned for more coffee, and had clearly come in no particular hurry, browsing the shelves with the deliberate slowness of a man who was not actually looking for anything. The third time had been on the steps of the church during a town social, where he had asked her if she was enjoying the evening, and she had said she was, and he had nodded as though she had said something of tremendous importance, and then they had stood together in a silence that was somehow not uncomfortable at all, watching the fiddle player tune up inside. The fourth time had been just last week, when a bad-tempered horse had pulled loose from the hitching post outside the store and gone crashing through the awning of the milliner next door. and George Hunter had been the one who caught it, talking low and steady to the animal until it calmed, his hands firm and patient on the bridle. When Letitia had come out to see what the commotion was, he had looked up at her through the settling dust and grinned, and something in that grin had done something strange and inconvenient to her chest. Now he rode past without looking her way, following the wagon down toward the stockyards, and Letitia picked up her uncle's letter and went back inside. Her father, Thomas Conley, was behind the counter sorting canned goods with the methodical attention he gave to everything. He was 51 years old and had the build of a man who had done physical work his whole life, broad through the shoulders, thick in the hands. He had built the store himself and took a quiet pride in it. When Letitia handed him the letter without a word, he read it standing up, his lips moving slightly over the longer sentences. When he finished, he set it on the counter and looked at her. "You should consider it seriously," he said. "I know," Letitia said. "Edmund can give you things I cannot," he said, and there was no self-pity in his voice, only the clear-eyed honesty of a man who had made his peace with his circumstances. "He can give you comfort and security and a future that does not depend on whether the cattle market holds." "I know that too," Letitia said. But, her father said because he knew her, had always known her. Letitia looked around the store, at the rough-hewn shelves and the barrels of flour and dried beans, at the window that framed the dusty street and the endless flat horizon beyond it. She had grown up in Philadelphia in a neat row house with a parlor and a piano and a mother who pressed her dresses with careful precision. She had been educated at a decent school and had read widely and played piano passably well and had been groomed, in the quiet and indirect way that girls of her era were groomed, for exactly the kind of life her uncle was now formally offering her. And yet, "Not yet," she said. "Give me some time to think." Her father nodded and went back to his canned goods, and Letitia went to put on her apron. The cattle season was in full swing by mid-April, which meant Caldwell was loud and busy from before dawn until well past midnight. The drives came up the Kisham Trail from Texas, great rippling seas of longhorn cattle guided by crews of dusty, exhausted cowboys who descended on the town like a particularly thirsty storm. They spent their pay in the saloons and the hotels and the stores, and Thomas Conley's dry goods business did well during the season, which was a mercy because the winters were lean. Letitia worked the counter 6 days a week. She was good at it, good with numbers and good with people in the particular way that required patience without subservience. She could add a column of figures in her head faster than most men could do it with pencil and paper, and she did not let customers short her, which happened often enough that she had developed a tone of voice specifically for the occasion. George Hunter came in on a Thursday afternoon in late April, and this time there was no pretense of browsing. He came to the counter directly, set his hat on top of it, and looked at her with an expression of such concentrated determination that she nearly took a step back. "Miss Conley," he said, "I have been wanting to say something to you for some weeks, and I have been working up to it, and I think if I do not just say it now, I never will." Letitia folded her hands on the counter and waited. "I would very much like to take you for a walk this Sunday after church services," he said, "if that is something you would be willing to do." His hands were resting flat on the counter. She noticed them because she always noticed hands. It was a habit of observation she had developed, and George Hunter's hands were remarkable in a particular way. They were large and thoroughly calloused, the skin roughened across the palms and the inside of the fingers from years of rope and reins, the knuckles a little enlarged, the nails cut short and practical. They were the hands of a man who worked, truly worked, with his body every day of his life. She thought involuntarily and with a clarity that surprised her that there was something she trusted about hands like that. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." He blinked, as though he had not entirely expected success, and then the grin came back, the one that had done the inconvenient thing to her chest before, and it did it again. They walked on Sunday after church. east along the edge of town, where the prairie opened up and the grass was spring green, and the sky was the particular deep blue that only existed in Kansas in April. George was a careful walker, matching his longer stride to hers, and he talked the way men who spent a lot of time in silence talked when they finally had someone to talk to, which was to say he talked quite a lot once he started. He told her he was from Lampasas County in Texas, that his father had been a cattle rancher who had lost most of his herd to drought in the early part of the decade, that he had been driving cattle north since he was 18 because it paid, and because he was good at it. He had a mother still living in Texas and a younger brother, who was learning to manage a section of their father's reduced but surviving ranch. He said he liked the work but that he was tired of moving, that what he wanted, what he had been saving toward for 2 years now, was his own piece of land. He had identified 40 acres southeast of Caldwell that were available for a reasonable price, and he had spoken to the land agent twice already. 40 acres is not much, he said, not apologetically but honestly. It is enough to start, Letitia said. He looked at her sideways, and the look held something careful and warm in it. That is exactly what I think, he said. She told him about the letter from her uncle. She did not plan to. It simply came out as the natural continuation of a conversation between two people who were being honest with each other, which was itself a thing that surprised her. She watched his face while she told him, looking for the particular expression men sometimes wore when a woman's prospects improved over their own, the one that looked like interest recalculating itself. It did not come. He listened carefully, and when she finished, he said, "What do you want to do?" "I do not know yet," she said. "That is an honest answer," he said. "Most people tell me I would be foolish not to go," she said. "Most people are probably right," he said, without heat or grievance. "Boston is a good city. Edmund Hartwell sounds like a man who can provide." "He is," Letitia agreed. "He can." They walked a little further in silence. The prairie wind moved through the grass around them in long, slow waves, and somewhere distant a meadowlark was singing with absolute conviction. "But," George said, echoing her father so precisely that she almost smiled. "I have not decided there is a but yet," she said carefully. He nodded. "All right," he said. "Then walk with me again next Sunday and we will see what you have decided by then." She did, and the Sunday after that, and the one after that. By the 5th Sunday, they were not walking along the edge of town but out across the open prairie itself, following a faint track that led southeast toward the section of land George had his eye on. He had described it to her in careful detail, the low rise of the land, the seasonal creek that ran along the eastern boundary, the stand of cottonwood trees that meant the water table was close enough to support a well. She had listened to these descriptions with a growing attention that she recognized, somewhere in the back of her mind, as the attention of someone who was beginning to imagine something. The land itself was flat and spare and beautiful in the way that open country is beautiful, which is to say it asked something of you before it gave anything back. You had to stand still long enough and look honestly enough before the subtlety of it resolved into something worth seeing. The sky was enormous. The grass moved. The cottonwoods along the creek were pale green and trembling. "Here," George said, stopping at the top of a low roll in the ground. He turned slowly, looking at all of it, and there was an expression on his face that Letitia had not seen there before, something open and young and entirely unguarded. She stood beside him and looked at it too, the long sweep of grass and sky, the thread of the creek, the country that went on in every direction without a wall or a fence or a rooftop to interrupt it. "It is remarkable," she said quietly. "I think so," he said, equally quietly. They stood that way for a long moment, side by side, their shoulders not quite touching, both looking at the same piece of ground. "I would build the house there," he said, pointing toward the cottonwoods, "for the shade and the water." "And a garden on the south side," Letitia said, before she had entirely decided to say it, "for the sun." He turned and looked at her, and she turned and looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched out long and warm and full of things that did not require words. "Letitia," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded different than it did in anyone else's, slower and more deliberate, like he was giving it its proper weight. "Do not say anything yet," she said, not because she did not want to hear it, but because she needed to be certain of herself first, and she was not quite certain yet. "All right," he said, again with that uncomplaining, unhurried patience that seemed to be the center of who he was. They walked back to town in the late afternoon light, and the shadows of the cottonwoods stretched long across the grass behind them. The letter she wrote to her uncle that evening was not a refusal. It was a postponement, carefully worded, asking for another month to consider his generous offer and thanking him for his patience and kindness. She wrote it by lamplight at the small desk in the room she shared with her younger sister Clara, who was 17 and had none of Letitia's reservations about frontier life, and was in fact enthusiastically in love with every aspect of Kansas. Clara read the letter over Letitia's shoulder without being invited to do so, which was completely characteristic of her. "You are in love with that cowboy," Clara said. "I am considering an offer from our uncle," Letitia said. "You are in love with that cowboy and you are afraid to say so," Clara said, with the comfortable certainty of someone who had not yet learned to be afraid of her own feelings. "Go to bed, Clara." "His hands are very nice," Clara said, heading for her side of the room. "I notice you always look at them." Letitia sealed the letter and did not respond, which Clara correctly interpreted as confirmation. The month of May moved through Caldwell like the cattle drives themselves, fast and loud and full of incident. The town had a restlessness to it during the season, a charged quality that came from so many men passing through with money in their pockets and nowhere particular to be once the herd was delivered. There were fights in the saloons and arguments at the stockyards, and the occasional crack of a pistol in the night that everyone pretended not to hear. Letitia was behind the counter on the second Tuesday of May when the trouble came into the store. His name was Dale Pryor, and he was one of the drovers from a Texas outfit that had come through the day before. He was in his 30s, heavyset, with the particular confidence of a man who had never been told no in a way that held. He had been drinking, not heavily but enough, and he came to the counter and bought a plug of tobacco, and then stood there leaning on the counter with the easy presumption of a man who considered himself charming. He said several things to Letitia that she did not reply to beyond the minimum courtesy required to conduct business, and when she made it clear the transaction was complete, he did not move. "Come on now, sweetheart," he said. "I am just being friendly." "I appreciate the custom," Letitia said. "Good afternoon." "You are a pretty thing to be standing behind a counter in a dusty store," Pryor said, leaning a little closer. "You ought to come have a drink with me at the Occidental." "No thank you," Letitia said, in the voice she had developed for occasions of exactly this kind, clear and final and leaving no room for negotiation. The door behind Pryor opened and George Hunter came in. He took in the scene in about 1.5 seconds, the way men who were quick-thinking took in situations, and he said, pleasantly but without warmth, "Afternoon, Pryor. You find everything you needed." Pryor turned and looked at George, reassessing the room. George was leaning against the door frame with his arms folded, not aggressive, not threatening, just present in the particular way that made it clear he intended to stay present. "Just talking to the lady," Pryor said. "Lady says she is done talking," George said just as pleasantly. "You need anything else from the store?" There was a beat, and then Pryor picked up his tobacco and left without another word, and George held the door for him and then let it close. He came to the counter and looked at Letitia with a careful expression. "You all right?" "I am perfectly fine," she said, and she was, because she dealt with men like Dale Pryor on a regular basis and had done so long before George Hunter had appeared in her life. But she was also quietly and in a way she did not examine too closely right at that moment, very glad he had come in when he had. "I am sorry if I overstepped," he said. "You seemed like you had it handled." "I did," she said, "but thank you." He bought a spool of heavy thread and a packet of needles, neither of which she suspected he actually needed, and left with a nod. Clara appeared from the back storeroom where she had been listening. "He likes you so much," she said. "Clara," Letitia said. "He bought needles," Clara said. "What on earth does a cowboy want with needles?" "Perhaps he mends his own clothes," Letitia said. "He does," Clara said with the authority of someone who had been asking around. "He does everything himself. He is very self-sufficient, apparently. The other drovers say he is the steadiest man on the crew." Letitia looked at the packet of needles on the counter for a moment, and then she put it in the drawer under the register and went back to her work. On the third Sunday in May, George brought her wildflowers. He appeared at the door of the store just after the noon meal, hat in hand, holding a bunch of prairie flowers he had clearly gathered himself, purple and yellow and a deep burning orange, the stems a little crooked and the arrangement entirely artless. He held them out to her with an expression that was trying very hard to be casual and not quite managing it. Letitia took them and pressed her lips together against the thing that was happening to her face, which wanted very badly to become a full and unqualified smile. "They were growing along the creek," he said. "They are beautiful," she said, and she meant it entirely. They walked again that afternoon, and this time she did not wait for him to initiate the conversation. She asked him questions, real ones, and he answered them with the same honesty he applied to everything. She asked him what had been the hardest thing he had ever done, and he said driving cattle through the Red River crossing in a flood year, when 3 men had nearly drowned and he had gone in after one of them and the water had been so cold and so fast that he had not been sure any of them would make it to the far bank. She asked him what he was most afraid of, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, simply, "Wasting my life on something that does not matter." "What matters to you?" She asked. "Land," he said. "Work I can stand behind, people I care about." He paused. "Being a man worth something to someone." She thought about that for a long time as they walked, the grass bending around them in the warm May wind. "I have been thinking about my uncle's offer," she said. He did not speak, just walked steadily beside her. "It is a good offer," she said. "Objectively, it is a generous and sensible offer. Boston is everything he says it is. The life he is describing is comfortable and respectable and safe." "Yes," George said, "but it is his life," she said. "His house, his children, his city, his social circles. I would be living inside someone else's life and managing it for them." He looked at her then steadily, not prompting but listening with his whole attention, which she had come to understand was something he did, gave his full attention to things, did not divide or deflect it. "I want my own life," she said. "I want to build something, not maintain something that is already built." The words surprised her a little with their clarity, the way true things sometimes did when you finally said them out loud. George stopped walking and she stopped with him. They were standing in the middle of the open prairie, the town a mile behind them, the cottonwoods of the creek visible to the east. The sky was enormous and very blue, and a hawk was circling high up, turning lazy, patient circles on the thermal. "Letitia," he said, with that careful weight he always gave her name. "I am not a wealthy man. I have saved enough to buy that 40 acres and to build something modest on it, and what I can offer you is work and open country and a life we would have to build from the ground up." "I know that," she said. "Boston is a city of considerable comfort," he said, and she could see what it cost him to say it fairly, to lay it out honestly when every line of him wanted to say something else entirely. "George," she said. He looked at her. "I do not want Boston," she said. "I want the 40 acres and the cottonwoods and the garden on the south side for the sun." The look that came over his face was something she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. It was the look of a man who has been holding himself very carefully, and who has been given, quite unexpectedly and altogether perfectly, permission to put the careful down. He reached for her hand, both of his wrapped around hers, his calloused palms warm and solid, and she felt the roughness of them and thought, yes, these are the hands I trust. "I have to ask your father," he said. "You do," she agreed. "I am going to be nervous about that," he said. "He will like you," she said. He values honest men." He kissed her hand then, the back of it, a careful and serious press of his lips against her knuckles, and she felt it move up her arm and into her chest and settle there like something that had found its proper place. Thomas Conley liked George Hunter. Not immediately, because Thomas Conley did not like anyone immediately, but over the course of an hour-long conversation in the back room of the store, in which George spoke plainly about his prospects and his intentions and his means, and answered every question Thomas put to him without evasion or embellishment, Thomas arrived at a considered respect that was worth considerably more than immediate warmth. When George asked for permission to court Letitia formally with the intention of marriage, Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying the younger man. "She has other prospects," he said. "Good ones, you know that." "I know it," George said, "and I would not try to talk her out of them. It would have to be her own choice." Thomas nodded slowly. "She has already made it," he said. "She is stubborn that way, always has been. Once she has decided something, you might as well try to redirect the Kansas wind." He paused. "You will need a license and a parson." "Yes, sir," George said. "And you will need to write to her uncle," Thomas said, with the faint expression of a man who was not entirely without his own misgivings, "because Edmund Hartwell is not a man who takes well to being told no, and I would rather he hear it from me than through gossip." "Yes, sir," George said again. Thomas extended his hand and George shook it, and Thomas held on a moment longer than necessary and looked at him. "You be good to her," he said. It was not a request. "Every day of my life," George said, and he meant it with every calloused, sun-darkened, bone-deep part of himself. The letter to Edmund Hartwell was the hardest thing Letitia had ever written. She sat with it for 2 evenings, drafting and discarding, before she arrived at something she felt was worthy of the man and the relationship and the decision. She thanked him thoroughly and specifically for his generous offer, acknowledged the real comfort and real opportunity it represented, and explained with as much grace as she could manage that she had decided to remain in Kansas and to marry a man she loved and to build a life of her own choosing on the frontier. She expected him to be disappointed. She did not expect the response she received 3 weeks later, which was 3 tightly written pages of displeasure, several pointed observations about the irrationality of romantic sentiment, and a formal withdrawal of any future offers of assistance from the Hartwell family. She read the letter at the store counter, folded it precisely, and placed it in the stove. Clara watched this with wide eyes. "What did he say?" "Nothing that requires a response," Letitia said. "Are you all right?" Clara asked, with uncharacteristic gentleness. Letitia considered the question honestly. She thought about the brownstone on Beacon Hill and the lavender water and the comfortable weight of a life already constructed and waiting. She thought about the 40 acres southeast of town and the cottonwoods and the hawk turning circles in the enormous Kansas sky. "Yes," she said, "I am perfectly all right." George bought the 40 acres on the 2nd of June, 1878. He rode out to tell Letitia the moment the papers were signed, coming straight to the store, still carrying the faint excitement of the land office in his expression, the document folded carefully in his breast pocket. He pulled it out and placed it on the counter, and she read it through, every line, and when she finished she looked up at him, and the look on her face was something that moved through him like a current. "It is ours," she said. "Not his, ours," and the deliberateness of that word was not lost on either of them. They were married on the 14th of June in the Caldwell Methodist Church by the Reverend Albert Thorne, who was a practical man and kept the ceremony to the essentials while managing nonetheless to give it proper weight and dignity. Letitia wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that her mother had made for her in Philadelphia years ago, and that she had brought west wrapped in brown paper and kept for an occasion exactly like this one. George wore a clean shirt and his good hat and stood at the altar with the posture of a man determined to do this right. Clara cried freely and without embarrassment. Thomas Conley did not cry but stood very straight and very still in the front pew and had an expression on his face that a careful observer would have recognized as a man holding himself together by main force. George's voice was steady when he made his vows. Letitia's was steady too, because she had already done all her trembling in private, in the room she shared with Clara on the night before, where she had lain awake in the dark examining her decision from every angle with the thoroughness she applied to everything important, and found it, every time, to be exactly what she wanted. When Reverend Thorne pronounced them married and George kissed her, it was not a tentative kiss or a performative one. It was a kiss that said, plainly and without decoration, "I mean this entirely." They spent their first weeks of marriage in a rented room above the hardware store while George began breaking ground on the property. He rose before dawn every morning and rode out to the land, and she rose with him and packed his meals and managed the store for her father. And in the evenings they sat together on the narrow steps of the rooming house, and he told her what progress had been made, and she made suggestions, and he took them seriously, which was something she would never take for granted. He built the house in the cottonwood shade as he had said he would, timber framed, the boards hauled from the lumber yard in town. He had help from two men he knew from the drives, solid and competent men named Burl Watson and Ike Sanchez, who gave a month of their off-season to the project in exchange for fair wages and the considerable quantity of food Letitia provided, riding out each evening with her father's wagon loaded with bread and beans, and whatever she had managed to cook during the day. Ike Sanchez was a Mexican-American man who had been on the drives with George for 3 years and was one of the finest carpenters Letitia had ever watched work, his movements economical and precise, his eye for level and square entirely reliable. The work he did on the house was work that would last, and Letitia made a point of telling him so directly, which made him stand a little straighter and nod with quiet satisfaction. The issue of Ike Sanchez and the town of Caldwell was one that Letitia observed with a growing and quietly furious attention. She noticed that he was served last in the stores and charged differently in the saloon and addressed with a particular carelessness that she found both familiar and infuriating. Familiar because she had seen the same patterns applied differently in Philadelphia. Infuriating because none of it had any basis in justice or common sense. She made it a point to conduct all business involving Ike with the same directness and respect she gave anyone else, and when a merchant on the main street made a comment in her presence that she considered unacceptable, she said so clearly and without diplomatic softening and did not buy from that merchant again. George watched all of this with a steady and approving attention. "You do not let things go," he said to her one evening. "Would you want me to?" she said. "No," he said, "I would not." By late August the house was standing, 2 rooms and a loft, with a solid porch along the south side where Letitia had planned her garden. It was not large and it was not refined, but it was made well and it was theirs, and when she walked through it for the first time, her boots on the new-laid floor, her hand trailing along the window frame that Ike had fitted perfectly square, she felt something so clean and complete that it took her a moment to recognize it as happiness in its simplest and most uncomplicated form. They moved in on a Saturday in late August. Their possessions fit in the back of the wagon with room to spare, which might have seemed meager and in a certain light was, but felt to Letitia not like absence but like beginning. That first night in the house, after the lamp was lit and the supper things were washed and put away, George sat at the table and she sat across from him, and they looked at each other in the quiet way of two people who had arrived somewhere together and were taking a moment to acknowledge it. "How does it feel?" he asked. She thought about it, really thought, because she always really thought about things people asked her. "Like the first day of something long," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her palm up to hold his, feeling those calloused hands around hers, and the lamp flickered in the gentle current from the open window, and outside the cottonwoods moved in the warm August dark. The first year was not easy, and she had not expected it to be. The garden on the south side went in late that autumn as an act of hope and forward planning, Rather than immediate harvest, winter preparations of soil and seed selection, and the careful reading of a book on prairie horticulture that she had ordered from a catalog, and that arrived in November well water-stained from the journey. She read it cover to cover by lamplight, making notes in the margins, and George read sections of it too, not because he needed to, but because he was interested in what she was interested in. He had a small herd of cattle by then, 12 head purchased with careful use of their shared savings, and he was learning the particular demands of being a rancher rather than a drover, which were considerable and different from trail work in ways that occasionally frustrated him, and that he talked through with her in the evenings with a methodical honesty she had come to love as one of his most fundamental qualities. He never pretended things were better than they were, and he never descended into the opposite error of catastrophizing when they were difficult. He simply assessed, considered, and decided what to do next, and she matched him in this, which meant their conversations about the practical realities of their life had a useful quality, two people who could look at a problem honestly and work on it together. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was brutal in the way that Kansas winters could be brutal, sudden and total and indifferent. The cold came hard in December and stayed hard, and they learned quickly which gaps in the house needed filling, and which chimney draft needed adjusting, and how many blankets were enough, and which were the best ways to conserve firewood without letting the temperature in the house drop to dangerous. George rode out to the cattle in conditions that were miserable and came back cold to the marrow, and she had hot coffee and a warm meal waiting every time, not because she considered this her sole role, but because the division of their labor in this particular life had evolved practically and naturally, and she understood, clearly and without resentment, that the survival of their herd in winter was essential, and that a man who came in from brutal cold needed warmth as urgently as anything. He understood equally clearly that the house ran because she ran it, that the garden plans and the household accounts and the careful management of their budget against a spreadsheet of expenses in her fine, clear handwriting were what kept them viable, and he said so, regularly and specifically, because he was not a man who assumed appreciation was understood and therefore unneeded. In February, when the worst of the cold had broken enough to allow a careful trip to town, they learned that Burl Watson had lost 3 fingers on his right hand to frostbite and would not be working the drives anymore. George went to see him immediately and came back quieter than usual, and that evening he sat at the table with his own hands spread flat before him, looking at them with an expression Letitia recognized as a man confronting his own vulnerability and the vulnerability of everything he depended on. She sat down across from him. "We will help him find something," she said. "He is a good man," George said. "Then we will find him something good," she said. As it happened, Burl Watson had a remarkable way with horses that did not require the use of his missing fingers, and within 2 months, he was managing the small livery stable of a rancher 15 miles east of Caldwell and doing well at it. But Letitia was always glad she had said what she said that evening, because George had needed to hear it and she had needed to say it, and both of them were clearer afterward about the kind of people they were when the world turned difficult. Spring came back to the prairie the way it always did, sudden and extravagant and a little overwhelming after the gray severity of winter, the grass greening up fast, the wildflowers appearing along the creek in the same purple and yellow and burning orange that George had brought her that first time. She found him picking them one morning when she came out to the porch in the early light, standing in the field 100 yards from the house with his hat off, and his face turned to the warming sun, a handful of prairie flowers hanging from one fist. She leaned against the porch post and watched him, the long morning shadows reaching across the greening grass, and felt something so enormous and specific and unambiguous that she could only stand still under the weight of it. He turned and saw her watching and held up the flowers, and she pressed her hand to her heart and shook her head slowly at him, at the hopeless impossibility of how much she loved him, and he laughed, free and full in the morning air, and came back to her across the grass. The garden was a revelation that second spring. She had prepared the south side ground carefully the previous autumn, working the soil herself with a fork and spade, adding what she could in the way of amendment. And when the seeds went in and the plants began to appear in their rows, she felt a satisfaction so physical it was almost like hunger satisfied. She grew vegetables practical and ambitious both, squash and beans and tomatoes, and a row of sunflowers along the fence that served no nutritional purpose whatsoever, but that she considered entirely essential. George built her a proper cold frame for extending the season and a simple trellis for the beans without being asked, because he had observed what she needed before she articulated it, which was something that continued to astonish her no matter how many times it happened. "You watch me," she said to him one evening, not accusing, only observing. "I always watch you," he said, with a simplicity that made her chest contract. Clara visited in June of 1879 and was enthusiastic about everything: the house, the garden, the cattle, the view from the porch at sunset, and George in particular, whom she assessed with frankly evaluative attention and pronounced to be, in her words, exactly the right kind of man for Letitia. "And what kind is that?" Letitia asked. "The steady kind," Clara said. "The kind who listens when you talk. The kind who looks at you like you said something worth hearing even when you said something perfectly ordinary." George was out checking the fence line and could not be consulted on this assessment, which was probably just as well. Thomas Conley came for Sunday dinner regularly through that first year and into the second, and the relationship that developed between him and George over those Sunday dinners was one of the things Letitia valued most about the life she had chosen. They did not talk about feelings or sentiment. They talked about cattle prices and weather patterns and the politics of the railroad and the management of land and the particular problems of frontier commerce. And in this talk, they built something genuine and respectful that was plain to see if you knew how to look for it. Thomas was a man who had made his choices and lived with them without complaint, and he recognized in George a man who operated by the same code, and this recognition was enough to build a friendship on. In October of 1879, Letitia understood that she was expecting a child. She sat with the knowledge for 3 days before she told George, not from uncertainty or anxiety, but from the sheer private immensity of it, the way a person sometimes needs to hold a thing in their own hands long enough to fully believe it is real before they can share it. She told him on a Thursday evening after supper, while they were sitting on the south porch in the last of the autumn warmth. She said it plainly, as she said everything, and watched his face. The expression that crossed it was something she had not seen before, something that moved through him visibly, from stillness to surprise to a wonder so complete and undefended that she felt her eyes fill. He reached for her immediately, both hands cupping her face with that careful, calloused tenderness, and looked at her for a long moment without speaking. "Letitia," he said finally, and that was all, just her name, but the way he said it contained everything. "Are you happy?" she said, though she could see that he was. "I do not have a word for what I am," he said. "I am going to need a larger word." She laughed, and he pulled her close, his arms around her, his face against her hair, and she felt the solid warmth of him and heard the Kansas wind in the cottonwoods and thought about the letter that smelled of lavender water and polished mahogany, the one that had arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, the one she had burned. She did not think about it with regret. She thought about it with the particular clarity of someone who has made a choice and lived inside that choice long enough to understand it completely. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was milder than the one before, and the house was better sealed, and the firewood supply was better organized, and George fussed over her in the careful and practical way that was entirely characteristic of him, not hovering or smothering but being reliably, efficiently present with whatever was needed. He built a cradle in the evenings by firelight, using good pine, working slowly and with attention to the joints, and she would sit across from him with her mending or her book, and listen to the sound of his tools and the fire and the wind outside, and feel the strange, enveloping peace of a life that had arrived at exactly where it was supposed to be. Their son was born on the 9th of March, 1880, delivered by Mrs. Ruth Alderman, the local midwife, who was 62 years old and had attended more births than she could accurately count, and who managed the whole proceeding with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had seen everything and was startled by nothing. George was in the front room and Letitia could hear him through the wall, not speaking, just present, his boots on the floor, back and forth once or twice, and she found the sound of him steadying in the way she had always found his nearness steadying. When she heard the baby cry for the first time, a loud, furious, entirely healthy protest at being introduced to the world, she heard George make a sound on the other side of the wall that she would treasure for the rest of her life. Mrs. Alderman put the baby in her arms and said, "A fine boy, good lungs," and went to tell the father he could come in. George appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, his face doing something she had never seen it do before, something that was beyond joy and beyond relief and beyond wonder, something that had no name because it existed in the country past the edge of words. He came and sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and she watched him look, and she thought that the two things in her field of vision at that moment, this man and this child, were the truest things she had ever seen. "What shall we call him?" she said. George looked at her. "Thomas," he said, "if you agree." She thought of her father standing straight in the front pew at their wedding, holding himself together by main force. "Yes," she said, "Thomas." The baby Thomas Conley Hunter came into a world that was, in that particular corner of Kansas in that particular spring, quite beautiful. The prairie was greening up and the garden was being prepared, and the cattle were healthy, and the cottonwoods along the creek were that extraordinary pale, trembling green of early spring. Thomas Conley Sr. arrived the second week after the birth and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at his grandson, with an expression that Letitia had never seen on his face in her entire life. He was not a man who allowed himself to be overcome, but he was a man who was, very clearly, overcome, and he stood in the doorway for a full minute before he trusted himself to walk across the room and take the baby from her arms. He sat in the chair by the window with Thomas Hunter in the crook of one large arm and did not speak for a long time. And outside the spring light came through the window, and the baby looked up at the old man with the unfocused, serious gaze of the very new, and Thomas Conley looked back at him with an expression of absolute love. George brought a chair and sat nearby, not intruding, just present, and Letitia stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the three of them and thought about choices again, about all the ways a life could go and all the different futures that had been possible, and the particular path through them that had led to this kitchen, this window, this light. The months that followed were full and exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Thomas was a healthy, active baby who objected strongly to sleeping during hours his parents considered appropriate, and who demonstrated opinions about his preferences from a remarkably early age. George proved to be exactly the kind of father Letitia had suspected he would be, thoroughly involved, practically competent, entirely undismayed by the physical realities of infant care, and possessed of a seemingly infinite patience for the small, repetitive rituals that babies require. She would find them in the early morning sometimes, George sitting in the rocker on the porch with the baby against his shoulder, talking quietly in the gray before sunrise light, not to her, to Thomas, telling him about the cattle and the weather and the state of the garden and whatever else came to mind. And the sight of it, her husband and her son in the morning dark, was so beautiful that she would stand in the doorway for minutes at a time rather than interrupt it. The herd had grown by the following year. George had added 10 head in the spring of 1880 and another 15 in the fall, and the ranch, which was what they were calling it by now, had the beginnings of something that looked like a going operation. He had hired a hand part-time, a young man of 19 named Luther Voss, who was reliable and learning quickly, and who ate supper with them 3 nights a week at Letitia's insistence, because he was boarding in town, and the accommodations there did not include regular hot meals. Luther Voss was from Ohio, and had come west on the combination of ambition and restlessness that brought a great many young men to the frontier in those years. He was earnest and good-natured and openly admiring of the life George and Letitia had built, in the slightly wistful way of a young man who is beginning to understand what he wants his own future to look like. "You two make it look easy," he said one evening at the supper table, watching Thomas, now past a year old, attempt to eat corn from the bowl with more enthusiasm than accuracy. "We do not," Letitia said. "We make it look worth it, which is different." Luther considered this carefully. "How do you know?" he said, in the tentative way of someone asking a question they have been holding for a while. "When the right person is the right person." George looked at Letitia. "You know," Letitia said, "because they make you honest. The right person makes you more yourself, not less." Luther nodded slowly, the way people nodded when a thing confirmed something they already suspected was true. By the summer of 1881, the ranch had 45 head of cattle and a reputation for quality breeding stock that was beginning to extend beyond the immediate area. George had a natural eye for livestock selection that was recognized by the ranchers around them, and he had been consulted twice by neighbors about their own herd management. He did not overstate his expertise, but he did not dismiss it either, and the quiet confidence with which he answered practical questions from other men was one of the things Letitia found most purely attractive about him, that complete comfort in his own competence. Ike Sanchez had settled 15 miles south with a small property of his own and visited occasionally, and when he came, George always found reasons for the visit to involve a meal and a lengthy conversation, and Letitia served the meal and joined the conversation because Ike was interesting and direct and worth talking to. The inequities he navigated daily were ones she could not fully understand from the inside but could observe clearly from the outside, and she held those observations with the attention they deserved. She was expecting their second child by autumn of 1881, which she discovered with the same 3 days of private knowing before she told George. He responded this time with the joy immediately at the surface, less overwhelmed and more simply, openly glad, and he reached for her hand across the kitchen table and held it and said, "Thomas is going to have someone to boss around." "Or someone to boss him," Letitia said. "Lord help us either way," George said. Their daughter, Eleanor Jane Hunter, was born in April of 1882, arriving with considerably more speed and considerably less drama than her brother had, as though she had decided the whole business of being born was something to get through efficiently. She was a compact and determined baby who from her first weeks showed an independence of spirit that made Letitia suspect she was looking at a reflection of herself at a very early age, and which made George, when he recognized it, laugh with delight. Thomas was 2 years old and initially skeptical of Eleanor, and then, as if a switch had been thrown one particular morning in June, entirely devoted to her. He would bring her things, toys and rocks and leaves, and once a very surprised frog, and present them with the solemn generosity of a child who has decided someone is worth impressing. Clara came for a week in July and declared Eleanor to be the most beautiful baby in Kansas, which Letitia accepted with grace but privately considered might be overstated, and helped enormously with the household work while Letitia recovered her full strength. Clara had grown into a young woman who was capable and warm and considerably more thoughtful than the 17-year-old who had said things like he bought needles across a shared bedroom, and Letitia was glad to have her and sorry to see her go. "I'm thinking of staying west," Clara told her on the last evening of her visit, sitting on the porch with Alina in her lap and Thomas asleep already, George out checking the stock in the late evening. I like it here, I like what it is. Kansas is not easy, Letitia said. You are not complaining, Clara pointed out. No, Letitia said. I am not. Clara looked out at the darkening prairie, the first stars appearing above the flat horizon, the cottonwoods black against the last light in the west. You know what I notice about you, she said. What? You are exactly as much yourself as you ever were, Clara said. More, even. You have not been reduced by any of this. I thought it might reduce you, and it has not. Letitia was quiet for a moment, thinking about this. He does not reduce me, she said finally. He expands me. Clara nodded, as if this confirmed a theory she had been developing. That, she said, is what I am going to look for. The years moved through the ranch with a steady accumulation of seasons and growth and incident. The herd grew to 60 head and then to 80. George added a proper barn in 1883 with help from Luther, who had by that point become less a hired hand and more a genuine fixture, a younger brother in all but blood, and from a ranching neighbor named Sam Pickett, who gave his labor in exchange for help with Pickett's own fence, repairs the following spring. The barn was solid and properly built, and George was proud of it with the quiet, specific pride he took in things done well. Letitia expanded the garden each year, adding a small orchard of apple and plum trees along the eastern fence that would take years to properly produce, but that she planned for with the long view she brought to everything. She started keeping bees in the third year, learning from a book, and from the old woman 2 miles north who had kept bees since before the war, and who gave her advice with the unvarnished directness of someone who considers that knowledge withheld is knowledge wasted. The honey was good, and the garden was better for the bees, and the orchard was coming along, and there was something in the whole interconnected system of it. Garden feeding family and bees supporting garden and orchard growing slowly toward abundance. That satisfied some deep organizational instinct in her and made her feel daily the particular rightness of having chosen this life. Thomas started school in Caldwell in 1885, 5 years old and opinionated about it in both directions, enthusiastic about the reading and the numbers and deeply skeptical of being confined indoors when the prairie was visible through every window. He had George's color and Letitia's eyes and the combined determination of both of them, which made him an interesting child to raise, and a child they both adored absolutely. Alina started school 2 years later, and took to it with an appetite that suggested she had been waiting impatiently for formal instruction to begin. She read everything she could access, and had a memory of extraordinary precision, and a way of asking questions that made Letitia think of herself at the same age, the child who wanted to understand the mechanism of everything. George watched his daughter's mind at work with the same undefended wonder he had turned on so many things, and Letitia caught him one evening sitting at the kitchen table while Alina worked through a reader several grades above her level, watching her with an expression of such pure joy that she had to press her hand to her mouth. He looked up and saw her and did not look embarrassed. He just looked happy. In 1886 there was a drought, the summer dry and relentless, and the creek reduced to a trickle by July and almost nothing by August. It was hard on the cattle and hard on the garden, and the prospect of the winter beyond it was not comfortable to contemplate. George managed the herd with careful calculation, making decisions about culling and supplemental feed and water hauls from the town that were sensible and unflinching, and Letitia managed the household budget with a precision that found every possible saving without compromising the necessities. There were evenings that summer when the exhaustion was real, and the worry was real, and neither of them pretended otherwise. They sat on the porch in the hot, dry night and talked through what they had and what they needed, and what the options were, honestly and fully, without hysteria and without false optimism. And this was one of the things she loved most about the life they had built together, that there was no subject that required dishonesty between them, that the truth, even when it was hard, was always the currency they traded in. "We will be all right," George said one August evening, looking out at the dry grass and the thin creek. "I know," Letitia said. "I'm not just saying it," he said. "I know that too," she said. "You never just say things." He turned and looked at her in the way he had always looked at her, with that complete and unhurried attention that she had valued from the very first walk they had taken along the edge of Caldwell on an April afternoon 8 years ago. "I love you," he said, simply and without decoration. "I love you," she said, with the same simplicity and the same complete intention. The drought broke in September and the creek ran again, and the autumn rains came sufficient, and the winter feed situation was manageable, and they came through it. Not without cost but intact. The ranch and the family and the thing between them that had never required a drought to prove itself but had been proved by it nonetheless. Sam Pickett's older daughter, a capable and direct young woman of 20 named Ada Pickett, married Luther Voss in the spring of 1887 in a small ceremony at the Pickett Ranch, and George and Letitia attended and celebrated with real warmth. Luther had been circling that particular future for the better part of 2 years, and had required, by his own admission, a considerable amount of internal rearrangement before he was brave enough to speak. Letitia watched him take Ada's hand at the altar, and thought about the evening he had asked her how you knew when the right person was the right person, and she thought she had given him a useful answer, even if it had taken him a while to apply it. Thomas Conley Sr.'s health began to decline in the autumn of 1887, not dramatically but steadily, the way a strong man's health sometimes declined, as though his body had decided it had done what it came to do and was now in the process of orderly conclusion. He had sold the dry goods store to a younger man the year before and was living more quietly, and he spent Sundays at the ranch now without exception, arriving in the early afternoon and staying through supper and the first part of the evening. He and George spent those Sunday afternoons on the porch with coffee, talking or sometimes not talking, the companionable silence of two men who had run out of the need to fill all the space with words. Thomas Hunter was old enough now to sit with them sometimes, listening with the particular attentiveness of a child who understands he is in the presence of something worth paying attention to. Thomas Conley passed on a Tuesday morning in January of 1888, quietly and without distress, in the room above the hardware store where he had lived since selling the house that had held the dry goods store. Letitia sat with him that morning and held his hand, the large rough hand of a man who had worked hard his whole life, and she talked to him quietly, telling him about the ranch and the children and the garden plans for the spring, and all the small specific details of a life she knew he loved because it was hers. He died before noon with his hand in hers, and she stayed with him for a long time afterward before she rose and went to find George. He was at the barn when she came, and he saw her face and came to her immediately, and she walked into his arms and pressed her face against his shoulder, and he held her, both arms around her, solid and warm and present, and she let herself grieve properly, which she had always known she would only be able to do with him. She cried for a long time, longer than she had expected, and he held her the whole time without moving or speaking, because he understood that what she needed was not comfort in words but comfort in presence, and he was the best she had ever known at being present. When she finally lifted her face from his shoulder, she said, "He knew I was happy here." "Yes," George said. "He knew. I am glad he knew," she said. "He knew from the beginning," George said. "He told me so the first Sunday he came to dinner. He said you had your mother's ability to know your own mind and your own heart, and that once you had decided something it was decided." She had not known this. She was quiet for a moment, holding it. "I miss him," she said. "I know," George said. "I do too." Clara came for the funeral and stayed 2 weeks, which was a mercy. She had indeed remained in the West and was now teaching school in a town 40 miles east, unmarried and purposeful and entirely herself, which Letitia considered both admirable and characteristic. They spent the evenings of those 2 weeks talking as they had always talked, the particular conversation of two sisters who knew each other completely. And when Clara left on the eastbound stage, Letitia stood in the street and watched it go and felt the full compound weight of the winter, the cold and the grief and the absence. And then she went home to George and the children and the fire in the hearth and the life she had chosen. Spring came as it always came, without ceremony or permission, simply arriving one morning as it always arrived. The first crocus along the south fence and the first warmth in the wind, and the meadowlark singing with that absolute prairie conviction. Letitia turned 32 in June of 1888, and George made her a birthday dinner with the particular concentration he brought to anything he considered important: pot roast and cornbread and the early strawberries from the garden. And Thomas presented her with a drawing he had made of the house, and Alina gave her a crown of woven grass with wild flowers tucked through it, and George gave her nothing that could be wrapped. What he gave her instead, after the children were in bed and the kitchen was quiet, was himself seated across the table from her with his hands folded, and the lamp lit between them, and the whole long look of their life together visible in his face if you knew how to read it, which she did, which she always had, from the very first Sunday walk, when he had said, plainly and without strategy, "I would very much like to take you for a walk this Sunday after church services. If that is something you would be willing to do." 32 years, he said. "Is that a comment on my age or on the state of the world?" She said. "Neither," he said. "I was just thinking about all of it, all the time. The whole thing." And, she said, he looked at her across the lamp with those dark, steady eyes and said, "I think about that letter sometimes, the one from your uncle." She was surprised. "Do you?" "I think about it, and I think about what would have happened if you had gone," he said. "And I think that whoever that man is who would have been standing here without you, I do not want to be him." The truth of it was so simple and so complete that she felt it all the way through. "I think about it too," she said. "I think about the brownstone on Beacon Hill and the lavender water. And," he said, "and then I think about the 40 acres and the cottonwoods," she said, "and there is simply no comparison." He reached across the table, and she reached across the table, and their hands met in the middle, his calloused and warm and entirely familiar, and they stayed that way while the lamp burned between them and the Kansas night moved outside the windows. The ranch continued to grow through the late 1880s and into the 1890s, expanding carefully and sustainably, never beyond what the land and the management could support, which was a philosophy George applied with the same steady judgment he applied to everything. They added another 20 acres to the east in 1889, bringing the total to 60, and a second barn was built the following year, Luther Voss and Sam Pickett providing the same returned labor that had built the first. Letitia's orchard began to produce properly in 1890, the apple trees bearing their first real crop 12 years after she had planted them as bare root whips in the east fence line. The harvest that first full-bearing autumn was modest but genuine, and she made apple butter and dried slices, and a preserves that lasted through the winter with some to spare. George ate a piece of dried apple the following February with the careful consideration of a man tasting something that required full respect, and said it was the finest thing he had ever eaten, which was probably not strictly accurate, but was said with a sincerity she did not question. Thomas turned 15 in 1895 and was doing real work on the ranch by then, capable and developing in the direction of the land with an ease that suggested it was where he had always been headed. He had George's patience with animals and Letitia's head for numbers, and a natural authority with the stock that other ranchers noticed and mentioned. He was becoming, slowly and in the right way, the person he was going to be, and watching that process was one of the deepest satisfactions of Letitia's life. Alina turned 13 the same year, and had ambitions that the Caldwell schoolroom was beginning to struggle to accommodate. She had read through every book the school owned and every book the small lending library in town possessed, and her questions had a sophistication that strained the available resources. Letitia wrote a careful letter to the superintendent of the county school system and received in return a list of recommendations for advanced study materials, and she ordered every one of them by catalog and paid for them without any second thought about the expense, because Aliner's mind was not something to be underfunded. George agreed without discussion, which she had known he would. "She is going to leave us someday," he said one evening, watching Aliner at the table with a dense history text spread open before her, her finger tracking the lines as she read with that familiar concentrated expression. "Yes," Letitia said. "She is going somewhere bigger." "Good," George said simply. It was, she thought, one of the finest things about him, that uncomplicated desire for the people he loved to have everything they were capable of having, without jealousy or proprietary concern. He wanted his children to be fully themselves, not diminished versions that stayed close, and this desire came from the same place in him that had, 8 years earlier, sat across from a woman he loved, and told her fairly and without self-interest that Boston was a city of considerable comfort. He had always been the kind of man who wanted the people he loved to choose their lives clearly, even when that choice was away from him. The fact that she had chosen toward him was the best thing that had ever happened in either of their lives, and they both knew it, and they held it accordingly. The century turned in the way centuries turned on the open prairie, which was quietly, with no more ceremony than any other night, the stars the same and the wind the same, and the dark pressing equally down on the grass in the old year and the new. George and Letitia sat on the porch on the last night of 1899 wrapped in a horse blanket against the cold, and they watched the dark together, and at some point he said, "New century tomorrow." "Same sky," she said. "Same sky," he agreed. They sat a while longer in the cold and the quiet, and then he pulled the blanket tighter around them both, and she put her head against his shoulder, and they stayed that way, until the cold made it unreasonable, and went inside. Thomas was 20 years old by then, and handling fully half the management of the ranch, talking through the other half with George in the evenings with the growing confidence of a young man who knows his own judgment and is learning where the edges of it are. He was a serious and good-natured young man who took the work seriously without losing the capacity for laughter, and who had, in the manner of young men on the frontier, begun to notice the wider social possibilities of Caldwell and its surrounding territory, with an interest that his mother observed with quiet amusement, and his father with a patience that was the patience of a man who remembers exactly what it was like to be 20 and very much in want of something specific. Aliner, 17 and brilliant and already outgrowing everything the county could offer her, had been accepted through correspondence to a women's college in Lawrence, Kansas, and would be leaving in the autumn. The acceptance letter had arrived on a Saturday morning in May of 1900, and Aliner had read it standing in the kitchen and then very carefully and precisely set it on the table and looked at her mother. Letitia had read it and then crossed the kitchen and hugged her daughter with the full force of everything she felt. Aliner left on the Lawrence stage in August. George loaded her trunk in silence and helped her up and held her hands for a moment and looked at her. "Write to us," he said. "Every week," she said. "Work hard," he said. "You already know how, but say it back to me." "I will work hard," she said. "I will work very hard." "Good," he said, and released her hands and stood back, and the stage went. He and Letitia walked back to the wagon in silence and drove home in silence, and when they came into the house that was quieter by exactly the amount of one particular person, George sat down at the table and folded his hands and looked at them. Letitia put the coffee on and sat across from him. "She is going to do remarkable things," she said. "I know it," he said. "You are proud of her," she said. "More than I know how to say," he said. "You do not have to say it," she said. "She knows." He looked up from his hands and across the table at her, and the look was the same one it had always been, full and steady and entirely committed. "You are a good mother," he said. "You are a good father," she said. "We are pretty good at this," he said, with the ghost of the grin that had always done the thing to her chest, still doing it, 22 years on from the first time, still doing it without any reduction. "We are," she said. "We are very good at this." Thomas came in from the barn with mud on his boots and the comfortable ease of a young man who belonged where he was, and he looked at his parents across the table with their coffee and their quiet and said, "Alina is going to be the most educated person in this family within 5 years." "Within 3, Letitia said. "Within 2, George said, and they all three of them laughed, and the kitchen was full of it. The laughter and the coffee smell and the good, warm, ordinary light of a Tuesday morning in August of 1900, on a ranch in Kansas that had started as 40 acres and a plan, and that had grown into a life so complete and fully realized that it seemed sometimes impossible to hold all of it. Alina did write every week, and her letters were dense and detailed, and full of the particular enthusiasm of a mind being given the tools it had always needed. She studied history and literature, and was very interested in the women's suffrage movement, which was gaining real momentum at the turn of the century, and she wrote to her mother about this in letters that had a tone of discovery, as though she was finding words for things she had always known. Letitia wrote back with equal density, telling her about the ranch and the orchard and the progress of her current reading, and her own thoughts on the questions Alina was wrestling with, and the correspondence between them was one of the great pleasures of both their lives. A conversation that had been running since Alina was old enough to have opinions, and that would run, they both understood, for as long as they lived. Thomas married in the summer of 1902, a young woman of 21 named Ruth Halley, the daughter of a rancher from a neighboring county, who was calm and practical and clearly capable, and who looked at Thomas with the unambiguous warmth of a woman who knows exactly what she has and intends to hold on to it. The wedding was at the ranch, on the south porch in the garden, and Letitia had spent 2 weeks preparing the garden to be exactly right, and it was. George walked Thomas to the makeshift altar under the apple trees, which were in full production now, the branches heavy, and stood beside his son for a moment before the ceremony, and Letitia, watching from the porch, saw him say something to Thomas, just a few words, his hand briefly on his son's shoulder. She did not ask him afterward what he had said. She did not need to know the exact words. She could see what they were from the way Thomas stood differently after he heard them, straighter and more certain, ready. Alina came home from Lawrence for the wedding and brought with her a classmate named Margaret Price, who was studying the law, which was very new for women, and being done in the face of considerable resistance from the institutions of the day. Margaret was fierce and quick, and entirely unintimidated by anything, and Letitia found her immediately fascinating, and spent most of the wedding weekend in conversation with her when protocol allowed. "Your mother is extraordinary," Margaret told Alina, and Alina said without any self-consciousness, "I know it. She has always been." By 1904, Thomas and Ruth had a son of their own, a large and good-natured baby named William, who arrived in February with all the particular vigor of a child, who intended to take up as much space as possible. George held his grandson in the kitchen of the main house, sitting in the same chair where Thomas Conley Sr. had sat with baby Thomas 24 years before, and he held the baby with the same careful, astonished tenderness, and Letitia stood in the doorway and felt the full circular weight of time in the best possible way. She was 48 years old. George was 52. The ranch was now 80 acres and running 100 head, well managed and productively operated, with Thomas doing the daily work and George the oversight and long-term planning. The orchard was magnificent. The garden was the garden of an experienced and confident grower, planned with the deep seasonal knowledge of 25 years. Alina graduated from college in 1903 and went directly into a teaching position at a school in Lawrence, where she was also involved in organizing with the suffrage movement. She came home for Christmases and summers, and her visits were events, her presence filling the house with her characteristic energy and the particular pleasure of a mind that had been fully developed and was operating at full capacity. She would never marry, she said, not bitterly but factually, because she had not met anyone she wanted to accommodate in her life who could fully accommodate her in theirs. And she said this with the clean-eyed self-knowledge that she had always had, that Letitia recognized as a direct inheritance and was entirely proud of. The right person would not require accommodation, Letitia told her. They would require expansion. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Like you and father. Like your father and me, Letitia said. I have not stopped looking, Eleanor said. I have simply not found. Then keep looking, Letitia said, and live fully in the meantime, which you are doing. I learned from you, Eleanor said simply. The letter Letitia had burned in the store stove 27 years earlier had long since become irrelevant in every practical sense. But she thought of it occasionally, not with regret or with triumph, but with the particular perspective of a woman who has lived inside a choice long enough to understand it completely. Her uncle Edmund Hartwell had died in 1895. She had learned through a distant cousin's letter. His household had been managed by a series of women after she had declined the position, none of whom had apparently remained long. His children had grown up and scattered. The brownstone on Beacon Hill had been sold. She thought about this not with satisfaction, but with the dispassionate observation of someone tracking what happens when a life is organized around comfort rather than purpose. She could not say that his life had been a bad one. She did not know enough of it to say that. She could only say that hers had been a full one, in every sense that mattered, and that she would not have exchanged a single calloused-handed, drought-enduring, cottonwood-shaded moment of it for all the lavender water in Boston. In the autumn of 1905, George came in from the barn one evening with a quiet in his face that she recognized immediately as the quiet that preceded something he needed to think through with her. She poured 2 cups of coffee and waited. He sat down and wrapped his hands around the cup and looked at her. "I want to go back to Texas," he said. "Not to stay, to take Thomas and show him where I came from. My mother is still living and she has not met her grandchildren, and I think it is time." It was a journey she had been expecting him to want to make for years. "Then we will go," she said. "All of us," he said, slightly surprised. "Did you think I would let you take Thomas to Texas without me?" she said. The grin came, the same grin, 27 years on, unchanged in any essential quality. "I hoped you would not," he said. They made the journey in the spring of 1906. George and Letitia and Thomas and Ruth and young William, who was 2 years old and constitutionally opposed to sitting still for extended periods. They went by train, the railroad having long since connected the territory in ways that made the journey of days rather than weeks, and arrived in Lampasas County, Texas in the warm green of a southern spring. George's mother, Mary Hunter, was 74 years old and small and upright, and in full possession of her faculties and her opinions. She received Letitia with the formal assessment of a woman who knows that the most important thing is whether her son is properly loved, and within the first hour had determined to her satisfaction that he was, and after that was entirely warm. She took Letitia's hands when they were introduced and held them for a moment, looking at her face, and then she said, "He wrote me about you. He has been writing me about you for 28 years. Letitia looked at George. He was looking at the middle distance with the particular expression of a man who is not going to apologize for something but is experiencing a certain mild embarrassment. "What did he say?" Letitia asked. Mary Hunter smiled. "He said he had found the most honest woman he had ever met, and that she had eyes that went all the way through you and hands that never hesitated at useful work." She paused. "He said he was going to make her a garden." Letitia pressed her lips together and looked at her husband and said, "You wrote that to your mother?" "I might have," George said, to the middle distance. "In the second letter he wrote after he met you," Mary said, with the satisfied certainty of a woman who has been proved right about something she always expected. "I knew then." The week in Lampasas was the kind of week that deposits itself into a family's history as something foundational, something they would tell and retell. Mary Hunter held William on her knee and told Thomas stories about George, as a boy that Thomas collected with the delighted attention of a son, who is hearing for the first time about his father as someone young and uncertain, and finding his way. And George endured these stories with the patience of a man who has no dignified alternative. George showed Letitia the country of his childhood, the hills and the cedar and the different quality of light in Texas, wider and hotter and more immediate than Kansas. And she looked at all of it with the attention she always gave the natural world and understood something more about who he was from seeing where he had come from. On their last evening in Lampasas, sitting on Mary Hunter's porch in the warm Texas night, Mary took Letitia's hand again, more briefly this time. "Thank you," Mary said. "For what?" Letitia asked. "For choosing him," Mary said. "He wrote me about the other offer, the one you had from Boston. He said he told you about the land and the hard work and the 40 acres, and he was afraid he could not compete with a comfortable life in a fine city, and he asked me to pray you would stay." Letitia looked at George. He was looking at the stars. "I did not know that," she said to him. He was quiet for a moment. "I was afraid," he said. "I had never been afraid of much in my life, but I was afraid of losing you before I had properly found you." She reached across and took his hand, those familiar calloused hands, and held it in both of hers. "I was never going to Boston," she said. "Not really, not after the first Sunday walk." He turned and looked at her. "What happened on the first Sunday walk?" "You showed me the land," she said. "You told me where the house would go, and I said the garden would be on the south side for the sun. And I knew." He held her hand with both of his in the warm Texas night, and Mary Hunter went quietly inside to give them the porch, and the stars were enormous above the cedar hills, and Thomas and Ruth were inside with William already sleeping, and the night was full and still and sufficient. "Letitia," he said, her name in his mouth with that same slow, deliberate weight it had always had, the weight of a man who understood the value of what he was saying. "I know," she said. "I love you too. I have always loved you. I will always love you." They came home to Kansas in June, to the ranch and the orchard and the 100-head herd and the south garden in full summer production. And the cottonwoods along the creek were enormous now, 28 years of growth making them into a proper grove. And the house in their shade was solid and seasoned, and had the particular beauty of a thing made well and lived in well. William ran in the garden, and Thomas checked the stock, and Ruth was expecting their second child. And Alina sent a letter from Lawrence that arrived the same week describing a suffrage rally she had organized that had drawn 300 women and 15 sympathetic men, and that had been covered in the local newspaper. George read the letter at the kitchen table and said, "That is our Alina," with the pride of a man who has done something right. Letitia sat across from him and looked at all of it, the kitchen and the man and the letter from their daughter and the sound of their grandson in the garden outside, and the whole weight of the life she had chosen settled around her like something perfectly fitted. She thought about the first day she had seen George Hunter, before she had ever spoken to him, before the spilled fabric and the needles he had bought as an excuse, and the prairie flowers and the Sunday walks, before all of it. She had seen him ride past the store on a spring morning in 1878, hat tipped against the sun, sitting his horse the way men who had grown up on horseback sat their horses. She had not known then what that particular cowboy with his calloused hands and his patient silences and his absolute honesty would mean to her life. She had not known about the 40 acres or the cottonwoods or the garden on the south side for the sun, or the children who would grow up in the shade of the trees they had planted, or the grandson who was now running through the strawberry bed at considerable risk to the crop. She had known only that there was something in the way he moved through the world that she recognized, something steady and true and worth knowing. She had been right. "What are you thinking about?" George asked, looking up from Alina's letter. "Everything," she said. "Good everything or worrying everything?" he asked. "The best kind," she said. "The kind that is only everything good." He folded the letter carefully and set it on the table between them and reached across, and she met him halfway, their hands together in the center of the table, his calloused and warm and entirely hers. Outside, William had found something in the garden of significant personal interest and was narrating it at full volume to no one in particular. And the cottonwoods moved in the warm Kansas wind, and the orchard stood heavy with the summer's coming promise, and the creek ran clear along the eastern fence, and everything, every single thing, was exactly as it should be.